The car smelled like cigarette smoke and old leather. Nina Cole sat in the back seat with her wrists resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching the city disappear behind her. Nobody had tied her hands. Nobody thought they needed to. There were 3 men in the vehicle. One was driving. One was in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone. The third sat next to Nina, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had been told to watch her. He had been watching the window instead for the last 40 minutes. Nina had counted every street they turned on. She had also counted the number of times the man beside her blinked without really seeing anything. People who were afraid did not blink like that. People who were bored did. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid in a very long time, and on the rare occasions when fear did find her, it came quietly, like an old friend knocking at a door she had learned to leave closed. Nina was 29 years old. She had dark hair that she kept in a low braid because loose hair was a liability she had learned about the hard way at 22. She had brown eyes that people described as calm. She had hands that looked ordinary and were not. The family that had traded her away was called the Hero family. They were not a kind family, and they had not been kind to Nina. Her father, Leonard Hero, had built his life on 2 things, territory and leverage. When the pressure from the north became too much to ignore, he had sat down with his 2 sons and his business partner and decided that his daughter was the cleanest thing he could offer without losing anything he actually valued. Nina had known this was coming. She had been the one to make it happen. It had taken her 8 months of careful work to engineer the conditions under which Leonard Hero would decide, on his own, that the right answer was to send her north. She had made herself seem useless to him in all the ways that mattered, and indirectly valuable in the one way that served her purpose. She had planted a rumor, through 3 separate people who did not know each other, that the man in the north believed the Hero daughter would be a symbol of good faith. That it would stop the pressure. Leonard Hero believed it because he wanted to believe it. The car crossed the northern checkpoint and the city vanished completely. The road turned to 2 lanes and the trees closed in on both sides. Nina watched the tree line without moving her head, using only her eyes, cataloging the gap between them, the density of undergrowth, the angle of the late afternoon light cutting through the branches. She was not looking for escape routes. She was looking at the land the way a person looks at a room they plan to spend a long time in. The compound appeared after another 20 minutes of driving. It was not what most people imagined when they thought of a place like this. There was no dramatic gate or high concrete wall. There was a long gravel road, a stand of birch trees that had been there for decades, and then a large house that had once been a farm. The kind of place that looked like it belonged to a family. A quiet family that valued privacy and had the means to ensure it. The man who ran it was named Armand Becker. Nina had been building a picture of Armand Becker for 3 years. She had done it from a distance, through documents and testimony and the careful reading of patterns that most people never noticed. She knew he was 41 years old. She knew he had been born in a city far east of here and had moved west as a young man with very little and had built something through a combination of intelligence and a willingness to be patient in situations where other people were not. She knew he had a scar on his left hand from a knife wound sustained when he was 19. She knew he read history books and kept them in a room on the 2nd floor of whatever building he was in. She did not know why he had agreed to the trade. This was the one gap in her picture. It was also the most important one. The car stopped in front of the farmhouse. The driver got out first, then the man in the passenger seat. The man beside Nina opened his door and stepped out without looking at her, then waited on the gravel with his hands in his jacket pockets. Nina got out on her own. The air outside was cold and clean. She stood on the gravel and let herself take one real breath before composing her face back into something that would read as quiet and uncertain. She was good at reading what a room needed. This room needed her to seem like someone who did not know where she was. A door opened on the side of the house. A man came out. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair going gray at the sides. He wore a plain dark shirt and dark trousers. He had the kind of face that was not immediately striking but became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He moved without hurry. He stopped about 6 feet from Nina and looked at her directly. Not the way most men looked at her when they thought they had power over her situation. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. Nina looked back at him. She let her eyes drop after 2 seconds. Not because she was submissive. Because she wanted him to think she was. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was lower and quieter than she had expected, "You can come inside." He turned and walked back toward the door. Nina followed. She was shown to a room on the ground floor. It was clean and simply furnished. A single bed, a wooden chair, a window that looked out onto the birch trees. There was a lock on the outside of the door. A man she had not seen before stood in the hallway and told her, without much expression, that dinner was at 7 and that she was expected to be present. When the door closed, Nina sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at the window. The light outside was fading. The birch trees were very still. She began to go through everything she had learned in the last hour. The layout of the entrance. The positions of the two men she had seen near the back of the property. The weight of the lock on her door and the age of the hinges. The way Armand Becker had looked at her. That last part she returned to more than once. She had expected a man who looked at people like objects. She had built her entire plan around navigating someone who saw value in things, not in people. What she had seen in his eyes in those 2 seconds before she looked away was something different. It looked like recognition. She did not know what he had recognized. She fired it away and kept walking. At 7 o'clock she was taken to a long table in the main room of the house. There were 4 other people already seated. 2 of them were men she identified as senior members of Becker's operation. One was a woman in her 40s who ran something administrative and had the posture of someone who had been underestimated her whole life and had found a way to use that. The 4th was a young man, maybe 22, who looked like he was still learning which fork to use. Armand Becker sat at the head of the table. He had changed into a different shirt. He nodded at Nina when she was brought in and indicated the chair across from the young man. Dinner was served. People talked around Nina the way they always did when someone new was in the room and they were not yet sure what she was. She ate quietly and listened to everything. She learned 3 names. She learned that there was a delivery expected on Thursday. She learned that the woman in her 40s was named Grace, and that Grace had an argument with one of the senior men twice over dinner and won both times, and that nobody at the table seemed surprised by this. Armand Becker said very little. When he did speak, the table adjusted to him the way a room adjusts to a sudden change in temperature. Not in fear. In attention. Near the end of the meal, he looked at Nina and asked, simply, "Do you read?" She looked up. She let the pause last one bit longer than necessary. Then she said, "Some." He nodded as though this was a complete answer and turned back to the table. Later, alone in her room, Nina sat on the wooden chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Somewhere in this house, in a room she had not yet reached, was the thing she had come for. A ledger. A name. The end of a thread she had been pulling for 3 years through every darkness she had been willing to walk into. She was close. She could feel it the way she could feel weather coming before it arrived. She was also already thinking about Armand Becker's eyes and the way he had said the word "red" like it mattered whether or not the answer was true. She closed that thought down the way she had learned to close unwanted things. Like a door, firmly, from the inside. She lay back on the bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did not dream about the ledger. She dreamed about the birch trees and how still they had been in the fading light, and how she had noticed without meaning to that they were beautiful. The first week passed the way water passes over stone. Slowly and with great patience and with the effect of wearing things down without anyone noticing. Nina learned the compound the way she had learned every space she had ever walked in, which was without appearing to. She followed the schedule she was given. She ate at the table. She took walks in the permitted area around the back of the house in the mornings, which happened to give her a clear view of the outbuildings and the timing of the 2 guards who rotated through the eastern end of the property. She asked for books. Grace was the one who brought them. She brought 4, without asking what Nina preferred, and the choices told Nina something about how Grace saw her: one novel about a woman starting over in a new place, one collection of poetry she had clearly picked at random, one history of a northern country that was dense and difficult, and one children's illustrated book that Grace had included either by mistake or as a small, private joke. Nina read all 4. She kept the children's book on the nightstand because it made the guard who checked her room every morning look slightly less interested in her. On the 5th day, she met the cook properly. His name was Henry. He was 63 years old and had worked for Armand Becker for 11 years. He was the kind of man who treated a kitchen the way other men treated a place of worship, which Nina respected. She started helping him with small things in the mornings: cutting vegetables, washing the heavy pots. Henry talked while he worked and Nina listened, and he told her things about the house without knowing he was telling her anything at all. She learned which rooms Armand Becker used and when. She learned that the room on the 2nd floor, the one she had predicted would hold his books, was also the room where he spent his evenings. She learned that he did not like company late at night and that the staff knew this without being told and arranged themselves accordingly. She also learned that Henry had been with Becker before the compound, before the territory, before any of the things that made Becker's name mean something in this part of the world. Henry spoke about that time the way very loyal people speak about a time they would never see again. On the 7th day, Nina was in the garden area when Armand Becker came out through the side door. This was not part of his usual pattern. She had his usual pattern memorized. He stood near the birch trees for a moment and then walked toward where she was standing and stopped a few feet away. He looked at the trees. She looked at the trees. After a while, he said, "Henry says you have been helping him in the kitchen." "I was getting in the way of my own thinking," she said. "Keeping my hands busy helps." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" She turned and looked at him directly. She had decided on the 2nd day that performing visible fear was the wrong choice with him. He was too perceptive for it. He would notice the performance and it would put him on guard in ways that were harder to manage than straightforward interest. "The history book Grace brought me," she said. "The one about the Northern Territories. There's a chapter about the land rights conflicts in the early settlements, and I cannot decide if the author is being deliberately misleading or simply doesn't know." Something shifted in Becker's expression. "Not much. Just enough to notice if you were watching for it." "Which author?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for 3 full seconds and then he said, "He's been misleading. He had a political reason to omit the 1887 agreements. It's addressed in a footnote in the secondary source." "Which secondary source?" He looked at her for a moment longer than he had intended to, she thought. "Come upstairs this evening," he said. "I assure you." He went back inside before she could respond. Nina stood in the garden for another minute and then looked down at her hands, which were completely still. She had not planned that exchange. She had not engineered it. It had simply happened, the way some things happen when you are not watching yourself carefully enough. She told herself it was useful. She told herself everything that brought her closer to the 2nd floor of this house was a step toward what she had come for. She told herself that the fact of his competence and the specific quality of his attention did not matter to her operation. She had told herself things before. She was very good at it. She went inside. The room on the 2nd floor was exactly what she had predicted and still managed to be more than she had imagined. Books along 3 walls. A long table covered with papers that he had organized in a way that looked like chaos but almost certainly was not. A lamp in the corner that gave the room a warm low light that made everything in it feel slightly more real than the rest of the house. He showed her the footnote. They talked about the book for over an hour. He was sharp and he argued with the ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life, and he was wrong about one point and right about 5 others, and when she corrected him on the one point, he paused and then said, "You're right," in a tone that suggested this did not happen to him frequently but was not unwelcome. She scanned the room the entire time they were talking. Not obviously. She had learned to do it at a level below visible attention, the way a person's body adjusts to a new temperature without the mind needing to direct it. She clocked the position of the papers. The small locked cabinet beneath the left bookcase. The fact that the cabinet was old but the lock was new. When she left the room, she carried those details the way she carried everything, quietly, completely, and with the certainty that at the right moment they would be exactly what she needed. She also carried something else. The memory of the way he had looked when he said, "You're right." As if being corrected by someone he found interesting was a kind of small pleasure. She set that memory down carefully in the part of herself she was not currently using. She had work to do. The second week was different in texture from the first. The compound settled around her in the way that any place settles when its people stop being cautious and start simply being present. The guard at her door became less formal. Grace occasionally left books on her windowsill without comment. Henry began saving her the first cup of coffee in the morning, which in his private hierarchy was a significant gesture. And Armand Becker began talking to her. Not in the way of someone conducting surveillance. In the way of someone who had found an unexpected thing and was still deciding what to make of it. He stopped by the kitchen once while she was helping Henry and asked her what she thought about a problem he framed in the abstract, something about how to determine the trustworthiness of a source when the source had every reason to be biased. She gave him a real answer. He listened with the kind of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was being genuinely processed rather than waited out. He asked her that evening, over the same dinner table with the same people, what she thought about patience as a strategy versus patience as a character flaw. Grace looked at Nina when the question was asked. Nina answered it and Grace looked at Armand Becker. Nina fired this away too. She was also progressing on the things that mattered more urgently. She knew the lock on the cabinet. She knew the old spare keys were kept in a drawer in Henry's kitchen, organized by room number, in a system Henry had created and never changed because Henry believed that a good system should not need to change. She had identified the two members of Becker's staff whose loyalty was conditional, which meant it was purchasable, which meant it was exploitable. She had found the dead signal that the Hero family had planted before the trade, a small device tucked into the wall behind the hall radiator, and she had left it exactly where it was because touching it would tell her handler something she was not ready to confirm yet. She was building toward a moment. She was very close to it. And then, on the 14th night, something happened that was not in her plan at all. She was at the table in her room, writing in a small notebook she kept coded in a personal shorthand nobody would be able to read without knowing her. She heard something outside, in the direction of the east garden. A sound that was wrong. Wrong in the specific way that only sounds wrong if you have spent enough time in places where wrong sounds matter. She was at the window in 3 steps. The birch trees were dark. The lights from the compound lit the gravel path but left the garden in shadow. There were 2 shapes moving at the edge of the shadow that had not been there 20 minutes ago. Nina stood very still and looked at the shapes and understood in the clear, flat way of someone who has learned to process threat without the interference of panic that the compound was about to have a problem. She thought about the locked cabinet. She thought about the ledger she had not reached yet. She thought about how many months of careful work were invested in this operation and how easily it could be disrupted by an outside event she had not planned for. Then she thought about Henry in his kitchen. Grace in her room. The young man who still did not know which fork to use. She moved away from the window. She reached under the mattress and pulled out the thing she had hidden there on the second day, which was compact and efficient and represented the one part of her old life she had not yet been willing to set down. She was at the door in 2 steps. The lock on the outside was not a problem for a person who had used 12 minutes on the 3rd afternoon of her stay to deal with it. She went out into the dark and toured the garden. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something she would describe to anyone afterward. When it was over, 2 of the shapes at the edge of the garden had retreated and 2 had not retreated because they were no longer capable of doing so. The compound's lights were on. People were moving and shouting. Nina was back in her room when the all clear came. She was sitting on the wooden chair. Her hands were in her lap. She was completely still. She did not examine what had made her go out there. She did not examine the fact that Armand Becker had been in the courtyard when it started and that she had known this before she reached the door and that this knowledge had been somewhere in the calculation even if she preferred not to place it there. She sat and listened to the house settle back into quiet around her. And she told herself, very firmly and very clearly, that tomorrow she would reach the cabinet. She told herself this with the same discipline she applied to everything. She told herself she believed it. He came to her door late. She heard his footsteps in the hall before he knocked, and she recognized them because she had already memorized the sound of the way he moved in this house. 3 steps with a slight pause before the 4th. An old habit from an old building he had once lived in, she thought, where the 3rd floorboard had been uneven. He knocked once. She said, "It's open." He stood in the doorway. He was not disheveled in the way of a person who had been in a fight. He was the kind of person who came back from difficult things already composed. She recognized this because she was also that kind of person. He had 2 cups. He held one out and she took it. He did not come inside. He sat on the floor in the hallway, his back against the door frame, and she sat on the bed, and they were 6 feet apart with the door open between them. She was not sure how long they talked. Long enough for the house to become fully quiet around them. They talked about nothing that was directly connected to what had happened and nothing that was directly connected to who either of them actually was. They talked about places. About the particular quality of light in different seasons. He said something about a river he had grown up near and she listened to the way he said it, which was with a care that suggested the river was not just a river. At some point he said, very quietly and not looking at her, "I know you are not what they said you were." She was quiet for 3-4 seconds. Then she said, "What did they say I was?" "Something that could be given away," he said, without losing anything. She looked at the floor. She was thinking very clearly and very quickly, and she was also aware that the clarity and the speed were not entirely helping her in this moment. "And what do you think I am?" she said. He looked at her then. The light from the hall was dim and warm and his expression was the most open she had seen it. "I haven't decided yet," he said. "I don't decide things quickly." She understood this to be true. She also understood it to be a warning and an invitation at the same time. He stood. He took the empty cup from her without her needing to offer it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. For what? She did not say what she was actually thanking him for. She said, "The tea." He nodded and walked down the hall. She listened to his footsteps until they stopped at the staircase. 3 steps and a slight pause. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She was aware that she was in danger. Not from the compound or the guards or the situation she had walked into on purpose. A different kind of danger. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that arrives quietly when a person who has spent years making themselves very hard to reach discovers, without planning to, that someone has found a way in. She catalogued this the way she catalogued everything. She looked at it clearly. She considered what it meant for her operation. She thought about the cabinet and the ledger and the name she had carried for 3 years like a stone in her chest. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. In the morning she helped Henry with breakfast. She drank her coffee first, as he always arranged for her. She looked out the kitchen window at the birch trees in the early grey light and she thought about the river he had mentioned and what it looked like and why she was thinking about it at all. Henry said something about the weather. She agreed with him. She kept her hands busy. She kept everything else very still. She found the ledger on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday, not a day the weather or the light or some convergence of signs had prepared her for. It was simply a morning that had the right shape for what she needed to do, and she was a person who had learned to recognize those mornings without waiting for better ones. Becker was in a meeting in the far building. He would be there for 2 hours. She knew this because his schedule had become, over 3 weeks, a pattern she could read as fluently as a language she had spoken for years. Henry was in the garden. Grace was in the town running an errand she mentioned at dinner the night before. The 2 men whose loyalty was conditional were both off the property for different reasons that had taken Nina some quiet effort to arrange. She was in the hall. The key was in her coat pocket. The cabinet was 12 steps up the stairs and across the room. She moved. The room was exactly as she had memorized it. The lamp off. The papers in their organized seeming chaos. The cabinet low against the left wall. She crouched in front of it, used the key, and felt the lock turn with the ease of something mechanical submitting to the right approach. Inside were three things. A small recorder. A folder of photographs. And a ledger, bound in dark blue, with no label on the cover. She opened it and began to read. She had been good at reading difficult things without reaction for years. She had trained herself out of visible response the way a person trains themselves out of flinching. But what she found in that ledger was not what she had been carrying for 3 years. The name was there, the one she had come for. It was there in plain ink, in a column of transactions, and it was connected to a date she knew. The date of her sister Claire's death. And above it, 3 entries earlier, in a different hand but connected by an arrow drawn in pencil, was another name. A code name, not a real one, but one she had seen before. On internal documents. In an organization she had worked inside for 6 years. She sat with this for a moment that felt longer than the clock would have measured it. The name above Claire's death was not the name of a criminal family or a territory warlord. It was the operational code for a department inside the structure that had trained her, directed her, and sent her here. She had been hunting one thing and discovered she was standing inside another. She had been the instrument of the people she came to expose. She photographed every relevant page. She put the ledger back exactly as she had found it. She locked the cabinet. She was downstairs and in the kitchen when Henry came back from the garden, and she helped him wash the morning cups, and her hands were completely steady. She did not speak. Henry did not require conversation. He told her once that the kitchen was one of the last places in the world where you were allowed to be quiet and have it mean nothing. She was grateful for this. She was grateful for Henry in a way she had not expected to be grateful for anyone here. She stood at the sink and looked out the window and walked through what she had found with the same systematic discipline she applied to everything. She mapped the implications. She mapped the choices available to her. She thought about the name in pencil above Claire's name and the people who had used that code and what they had been willing to use it for. She thought about Armand Becker. She thought about the meeting across the property that he was currently in. She thought about the 3 years of work she had inferred from the compound's organization, the contacts she had slowly identified, the specific shape of what he was building. He was building a case. She understood this now with a clarity that settled over her like cold water. He had been doing it longer than she had and from a different direction. 2 people circling the same wound. She dried her hands. She put the cloth down. She turned and walked out of the kitchen. She went upstairs. She stood in front of his door. She knocked. It was not the time she would have chosen. It was not the prepared moment, the controlled circumstance, the ground of her own making that she always preferred. It was simply the only thing she was willing to do. He opened the door. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, which she had come to understand was the way he looked when something had changed in a way he had not predicted. She held out one of the photographs she had taken. The page with both names on it. The pencil arrow. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at her. "How long have you known?" he said. "An hour," she said. It was the first completely true thing she had said to him since she arrived. It felt strange in her mouth. Not uncomfortable. Just new. He stepped back from the door. She walked in. What followed was not a single conversation but many conversations layered inside each other over the days that came after. Some were direct and some moved around the center of things the way cautious people move around a fire they are not yet sure is safe to stand near. He told her what he had been building. She told him enough of what she had been building. Neither of them told the other everything, because they were both the kind of people who had learned that giving everything was something you did once and only to someone who had earned it completely, and they were not there yet. But they were working. The first decision they made together was to leave the ledger where it was. Not because they were waiting. Because moving it too early would alert the wrong people that someone had found it, and they needed those people to remain comfortable for a little while longer. The second decision was harder, and Nina made it alone. She went to the hall where the Hero family's device was hidden behind the radiator, and she transmitted a single short signal, the code for "hold in, continue surveillance." This was a lie. It told her handlers, the people whose code name was above Claire's death, that she was still working for them. She was no longer working for them. She was working for something she did not yet have a name for. Something that had begun in a kitchen and a second-floor room and a hallway conversation with 2 cups of tea. Something that had started the moment she opened the ledger and understood that the enemy she had come to find was not in this house. Becca watched her from the doorway of the hall after she knelt by the radiator and stood again. "Are we doing this?" he said. She looked at him. "We are doing this," she said. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He walked back toward the kitchen, where Henry was already making the evening meal, and Nina stood in the hall for a moment and looked at the pale wall and the thin winter light coming through the window at the end of the corridor. She thought about Claire. She thought about Claire's laugh, which had been louder than it should have been for someone so small, and the way Claire had argued about everything from a place of genuine curiosity rather than a need to win. She thought about the name above Claire's name in pencil in a column in a blue ledger and what it would take to make that name mean something. She thought about how long she had been carrying the stone and how different it felt now that she was no longer carrying it alone. She went to help Henry with dinner. The work that came after was not clean or quick or without cost. Nina had known this going in, and she had accepted it the way she had accepted most difficult things in her life, not with peace, but with a clear accounting of what she was choosing and what it was going to ask of her. They worked from inside the compound and from outside it simultaneously. Becca had contacts Nina did not know about, built over 3 years of patient positioning. Nina had access routes and information pathways that Becca had not been able to reach. Together they covered ground that neither of them could have covered alone, and they both understood this without having to say it, which was its own kind of efficiency. There were nights when the work went badly. A contact they were relying on became unreliable. Documents they needed were moved before they could reach them. On one occasion, a meeting Nina had arranged through a chain of intermediaries produced nothing except the understanding that the people they were building a case against were more alert than expected. On that night she sat in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed and she went through the failure with the same discipline she applied to successes, mapping what had gone wrong and what could be adjusted. Becca came downstairs at some point and made 2 cups of tea without being asked and sat across from her and they worked through it together. He was not the kind of person who used difficulty as a reason to lose confidence. He was the kind of person who became more precise under pressure, which was something she recognized and valued because she was the same. "We need a different route to the documentation," she said. "I know," he said. "I have one. I've been waiting to use it because I only get to use it once." She looked at him. "Then we use it once and we make it count." He agreed. The route he had was a person. A woman inside the administrative structure that was protecting the people they were after. A woman who had her own reasons, private and significant, for wanting those people exposed. Becca had spent 2 years building the trust that made this woman willing to be a source. Her name was Diane. She was 54 years old and had the precise, careful manner of someone who had been loyal to an institution for a long time and had recently discovered the institution did not deserve it. Diane provided them with what they needed. Not a document they could take to a court, because courts were not the arena that was going to matter here. What she provided was something more immediate and more permanent, the verified, source connection between the operational code and the real names of the people who had used it. The people who had arranged Claire's death. The people who had sent Nina here in the belief that they were using her as a tool. The exposure was not dramatic. Nina had never believed in dramatic exposures. She believed in the kind that could not be undone. She and Becca built it piece by piece through 3 separate channels, each of which confirmed the others, and they released it in a sequence that was designed not to produce a single moment of revelation but a slow, unstoppable accumulation of detail that could not be managed or contained. The people who needed to fall did not fall quickly. It took months. But they fell. One resigned from a position that had never been publicly named. One found their network of resources severed in ways they could not trace back to a source. One found that every room they walked into had recently been informed of their presence in a way that made the room close to them. None of it was justice in the formal, courtroom sense. Nina had stopped expecting that kind of justice after Claire. What she got instead was the end of their ability to operate. The name above Claire's name became radioactive. The people attached to it became untouchable in the ways that mattered to people like them. It was not satisfaction. It was more like silence where a constant noise had been. She had carried the stone for 3 years. One morning she woke up and it was not there anymore. She lay in bed in the room that had stopped feeling like a temporary place and noticed the absence the way you notice a bruise that has finally healed. By how little it hurts when you press on the spot where it was. She told Becca that morning. She did not explain what she meant. She simply said, "It's done." He was at the window of the second-floor room, looking out at the birch trees. He turned and looked at her. "Yes," he said. They stood in that room for a moment in the quiet of something finished and they were both very still and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed saying right then. She left on a Tuesday. Not because the day had meaning. Because she was a person who made decisions and then acted on them, and she had made this one and the morning had the right quality of light for it, cool and grey with the birch trees holding their stillness against the pale sky. She packed what she had arrived with, which was very little, and she added the children's book from the nightstand. She told herself this was because she had grown attached to it in an ironic way, and this was partly true. Henry made her breakfast without being asked. He did not say much. When she was leaving the kitchen he put one hand on her shoulder for a moment. That was all. She understood it completely. Grace was in the hall. Grace said, "You know where we are," which was Grace's version of everything she did not want to articulate, which was considerable. Nina said, "I know where you are." Becca was outside. He had not arranged this to be a moment. He simply was outside when she came out, standing near the gravel path in his dark jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking the way he always looked, like someone who had already thought about this but was not going to tell you what he thought. He walked her to the gate. The birch trees were very still. At the gate he stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other with the full quality of attention that both of them had, which was considerable, and they did not say the things that could have been said, because they were both people who had learned that the things you hold too tightly tend to break under the pressure of the holding. She walked through the gate. The gravel gave way to the road. The road was long and straight ahead of her and the light was thin and the air was cold and clean. She walked. She walked for a while and the compound was behind her and the birch trees were behind her and the last 3 years were behind her and the 3 years before that and the morning Claire died and the day she had first heard the operational code that sat above her sister's name and the day she had decided what she was going to do about it. She walked until she came to a place where the road curved and beyond the curve was the small town with the one cafe and the bus that came twice a day. She stopped. She stood in the road and the silence around her was the kind that exists in places that do not have many people and do not need to. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Henry's hand on her shoulder. She thought about Grace's version of goodbye. She thought about the ledger and the pencil error and the weight of what she had carried and the different weight of what she was putting down. She thought about a river she had never seen in a part of the country she had never been to, and the way someone had described it at midnight over tea with the care of a person who said things they meant. She thought about 3 steps and a pause before the 4th. She turned around. She walked back the way she had come. The gravel crunched under her feet. The birch trees were still where she had left them, which was where they had always been. The gate was still open. She went through it. Becca was still outside. He was not looking at the road. He was looking at the trees. She did not know if he had turned away because he was giving her something or because he could not watch her go. She decided, after a moment, that it did not matter which. She stopped next to him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to say anything. They were both very good at reading what a moment required, and what this moment required was not words. After a while they turned and went back inside together. The door closed behind them. The birch tree stayed where they were. They were very still and they were very beautiful, which was something she had noticed on the first day and had never quite been able to stop noticing, no matter what else she had to think about. Some things you see clearly once and they stay with you whether you plan for them to or not. She had learned, over the course of everything, that this was not always a problem. Sometimes it was simply what it was. And that was enough.